Imagine waking up every single day knowing the sky itself wants you dead. No air conditioning, no cold water from a fridge, no sunscreen, just you, a river, and a sun so aggressive the Egyptians literally worshipped it out of fear as much as love. Temperatures in ancient Egypt regularly blew past 45 degrees Celsius in summer, and yet, somehow, an entire civilization not only survived here for over 3,000 years, they built pyramids, ran empires, raised families, and even found time to complain about their neighbors. So how did they do it? How did people with no electricity out-engineer the desert sun using nothing but mud, linen, and pure stubbornness? Grab some water, you're going to need it. This is how the ancient Egyptians survived the heat. Let's start with the most obvious problem: shelter. If your house turns into an oven by 10 a.m., nothing else matters. The Egyptians' answer was mudbrick, and it was genius. Nile mud, mixed with straw and dried in the sun, became the standard building block for basically every home in Egypt. Stone was for gods and pharaohs, mud was for the living, and mudbrick had one incredible property: it's a terrible conductor of heat. Walls were built thick, sometimes over half a meter, which meant the scorching daytime heat took hours to travel through them. By the time the outside was blistering at noon, the inside of the house was still cool from the night before. By the time night finally cooled the outside air, the walls started releasing the heat they'd stored, keeping the inside warm. It's basically a thermal battery, and they figured it out without a single physics textbook. Windows were small and placed high, near the ceiling, just enough to let hot air escape without letting the sun blast directly onto anyone inside. Doorways often faced north, catching the cooling breeze that blew in off the Mediterranean, while avoiding the brutal southern sun. And then there's the real MVP of Egyptian architecture, the Malkaf, or windcatcher. This was a tall, narrow shaft built on the roof, open on the side facing the wind. It funneled cool air down into the house like a natural air conditioner. No electricity, no moving parts, just smart geometry. Wealthier homes sometimes even place damp reed mats or basins of water inside the windcatcher's path, so the incoming air cooled itself further through evaporation before reaching the living space. Roofs, meanwhile, weren't wasted space. They were flat and used as an extra room, for storage, for chores done in the shade of a canopy, and as we'll get to later, for sleeping. Even the layout of homes played a role. Rooms were built around a central courtyard, often with a small garden or tree, creating a pocket of shade and cooler air right in the middle of the house that the rest of the rooms could pull from. Basically, Egyptian houses weren't just shelters, they were passive cooling machines built from mud and common sense. Now let's talk about clothes, because what you wear in 45 degrees Celsius heat can be the difference between fine and hospital. The Egyptians' go-to fabric was linen, made from the flax plant grown along the Nile, and linen just happens to be one of the best fabrics ever invented for hot weather. It's lightweight, breathable, and critically, it doesn't trap heat against the skin the way wool or thicker fabrics do. Air moves through it freely, sweat evaporates quickly, and the body actually cools itself the way it's supposed to. Most everyday clothing was also loose-fitting. Men commonly wore a simple wrapped kilt called a shendit.
Women wore straight, loose-fitting linen dresses called kalasiris. Loose clothing matters more than people think. It creates a layer of moving air between the fabric and the skin. Basically a personal breeze that follows you around. And the color? Overwhelmingly white or very light, undyed linen. White reflects sunlight instead of absorbing it, which is exactly why you'll notice most desert cultures throughout history gravitate toward pale clothing. The Egyptians weren't just being stylish, although yes, they were also extremely stylish. They were reflecting solar radiation before anyone had a word for solar radiation. Laborers working in the fields sometimes wore even less, just a simple loincloth, prioritizing airflow and mobility over coverage. Children, especially young ones, often wore nothing at all, not for lack of clothes, but because in that heat, less fabric genuinely meant less risk. Then there's the accessory nobody expects: makeup. Both men and women lined their eyes heavily with kohl, a dark powder made from ground minerals like galena. It wasn't just about looking mysterious for the tomb paintings. Kohl reduced glare from the sun reflecting off sand and water. similar to the black grease football players put under their eyes today. It also had antibacterial properties that may have helped protect eyes from infections common in a dusty, fly-heavy environment. And Egyptians of means used scented oils and fats on their skin daily, partly for perfume, partly for status, but also because it created a barrier that reduced water loss through the skin in that brutally dry heat. So, light fabric, light color, loose fit, and eye protection. The Egyptians basically nailed heat-appropriate fashion 4,000 years before moisture wicking became a marketing term. Here's something modern office workers can't even imagine. The Egyptians organized their entire day around avoiding the sun. The workday began early, often at first light, sometimes before. Farmers, builders, and craftsmen got the most physically demanding tasks done in the cooler morning hours, while the sun was still low and the temperature hadn't yet reached its peak. Then, as the sun climbed toward its most brutal hours, roughly from late morning through mid-afternoon, activity slowed dramatically. This wasn't laziness, it was survival strategy. Evidence from tomb paintings, administrative records, and workers' villages like Deir el-Medina, the settlement that housed the artisans who built royal tombs, shows clear patterns of reduced labor during the hottest stretch of the day, essentially a scheduled break built into the workday itself. People retreated indoors into those cool mudbrick homes we just talked about, or found shade under awnings, trees, or covered walkways. Even outdoor work, where unavoidable, was adjusted. Workers hydrated more, took shelter breaks, and paced themselves in a way that modern labor law would probably call reasonable, and ancient overseers just called common sense. As the sun began dropping in the late afternoon and the worst heat passed, activity picked back up again. A second work period stretched into the cooler evening hours. It's essentially the same rhythm you still see today in many hot climate countries. Spain's siesta, the goo.
If states adjusted business hours, except the Egyptians were doing it 3,000 years earlier, purely out of necessity. And speaking of records, the ancient Egyptians even used water clocks and sundials to structure their days, meaning this wasn't a loose, vibe-based system. It was structured, deliberate time management built entirely around the sun's movement and intensity. Religious and administrative schedules followed the same logic. Temple rituals tied to the sun god Ra were often performed at dawn and dusk, the moments the sun was considered most sacred and, conveniently, the moments it was also most bearable to be standing outside performing a ceremony. None of this works without water, and Egypt had exactly one reliable source of it, the Nile. Egyptian civilization is often called the gift of the Nile for good reason. Over 90% of the country is desert, completely uninhabitable without the river. Every town, every farm, every temple was built within reach of it. The Nile wasn't a nice to have. It was the entire reason anyone could live here at all. People drank Nile water directly, though it was often filtered through cloth or left to settle in large jars, allowing sediment to sink before drinking. Wealthier households and temples sometimes had access to wells, and canals distributed water further inland for both drinking and irrigation. Water wasn't just for drinking though, it was cooling technology. Egyptians used porous clay jars called zir pots to store water. The clay itself is slightly permeable, so a small amount of water seeps through to the outer surface and evaporates. That evaporation pulls heat out of the jar, cooling the water inside, sometimes by a significant margin compared to the outside air. It's the same evaporative cooling principle used in swamp coolers today, and Egyptians were using it millennia before anyone understood the science behind it. Wet reed mats were also hung in doorways and windows. As air passed through the damp reeds, it cooled down before entering the home, essentially a low-tech air conditioner running purely on airflow and evaporation. Bathing in the Nile, or in basins of water at home for the wealthy, was a daily ritual, both for hygiene and for the simple physical relief of cooling down in a climate that offered very few other options. And then there was beer. Egyptian beer wasn't the alcohol-forward drink we think of today. It was thick, nutritious, low in alcohol, and consumed by nearly everyone, including children, as a dietary staple. Because it was made from boiled grains and water, it was often safer to drink than untreated river water, making it an important and hydrating part of daily life. Diet also played a quiet role in beating the heat. Egyptians ate a lot of water-rich foods. Watermelon, which likely originated in Northeast Africa, cucumbers, and dates, foods that helped replace fluids and electrolytes lost through sweat, long before anyone had ever heard the word electrolyte.
Surviving the heat wasn't only physical. The Egyptians had to make peace with it mentally, and they did that through religion. The sun wasn't just weather to the Egyptians, it was the god Ra, one of the most important deities in their entire belief system. Every single day, Ra was believed to sail across the sky in a divine bark, battling the chaos serpent Apophis to ensure the sun would rise again. Every sunset was a genuine spiritual struggle. Every sunrise was a victory. Framing the sun this way did something powerful psychologically. It turned a punishing, uncontrollable force of nature into something meaningful, something with purpose and a story attached to it. The heat wasn't just suffering.
It was proof the gods were still fighting for the world. Shade, meanwhile, wasn't just physical relief. It was symbolically tied to the divine and to royalty. Pharaohs were sometimes depicted with sunshades held above them, and the concept of being sheltered under the shadow of a god or ruler shows up repeatedly in Egyptian texts and art, blending literal comfort with religious protection. Of course, sometimes the heat won anyway. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, like the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, include treatments for conditions consistent with heat exhaustion, dehydration, and skin ailments caused by sun exposure. Egyptian physicians, some of the most advanced in the ancient world, understood the value of rest, shade, and fluids as treatment, even without understanding the underlying biology of heat stroke the way we do today. Cooling remedies included applying wet cloths, resting in shaded, ventilated rooms, and drinking diluted fluids. Aloe vera, which grew locally, was used to soothe sunburned or irritated skin, the same plant you'll find in aftersun lotion today. And for the very hottest, most brutal stretches of summer, especially during the flooding season of the Nile called the inundation, heavy agricultural labor slowed dramatically anyway, since the fields were underwater and unworkable. Many laborers were redirected to state-building projects instead, often working in the shade of half-built structures or during the cooler parts of the day, showing yet again how deeply the entire society's rhythm bent around what the climate would allow. And finally, night. The one part of the day the desert actually gave them a break. Because deserts lose heat quickly after sunset, Egyptian nights could be dramatically cooler than the days, sometimes a difference of 20 degrees or more. Egyptians took full advantage of this by sleeping on their flat rooftops, catching the breeze and the cool night air, away from the heat still radiating out of the mud brick walls below. It was communal, practical, and honestly, probably the most peaceful part of an Egyptian's entire day. No sun, no sweat, just stars, the sound of the Nile somewhere in the distance, and a well-earned break from a sky that had spent all day trying to kill them. So the next time you're sitting in an air-conditioned room complaining about a hot summer day, remember the Egyptians. No AC, no sunscreen, no fridges, just thick mud walls, white linen, a scheduled siesta, a river they treated like a god, and a sun they treated like an even bigger one. They didn't just survive the desert, they built one of history's greatest civilizations directly inside it. If you want to see how they handled everything else this brutal environment threw at them, from privacy to boredom to giving birth in 45-degree heat, there's a whole playlist waiting for you right there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.